Well, this has certainly been a wild ride. From the moment I started writing my Jak 2 retrospective, I knew it would be controversial. Jak 2 is a beloved game for many, and even if I don't particularly enjoy it, a lot of people do. In fact, some consider it the best in the trilogy. I tried my best to point out both the best and worst of that game in my last video, but in the end, I was left disappointed. I assumed nothing could take that mishmash of genres and playstyles and turn it into a cohesive, enjoyable game from start to finish. I assumed wrong. Jak 3 was released 1 year after its predecessor, and it blew the second game out of the water. Improved level design, world traversal, and game mechanics all combined with a game that's somehow on an even larger scale than the first two games put together. And this is the game that I was hoping Jak 2 would be, refining nearly every element from the second game, reintroducing some from the first, and adding new features such as dune buggies and light powers in this Mad Max-inspired wasteland, all to make this game a stellar title in its own right. But it's never really discussed as much as the first two. Let's see if we can figure out why with this look at Jak 3.
Jak 3, we've got more variety in this than we've ever done. We try to keep it fresh, make sure that the player is always doing something new in the next mission. When we started Jak 1, we thought we wanted to introduce the idea of story-based gaming to the platform genre. But I think we really hit the mark on Jak 2, and we're really continuing it and taking it to the next level with some of the story things we're doing in this game.
Jak 3 was always intended to be exactly what it was, a more expansive version of Jak 2. Once again, there's limited information on its development, but what we do know is that Naughty Dog saw the foundation of Jak 2, and the positive reception made them decide to make Jak 3 a more grandiose experience, with influences from Mad Max and Smuggler's Run being the prime reasons for the desert setting and the vehicle combat that this game introduced. There was also a lot of work put into the animations and cutscenes, with nearly the entire developer commentary on the disc being about the difficulties the team had with the new character animations, the massive scale of the events happening on screen, problems with rigging models to their frames, and much, much more. Honestly, there's not a whole lot about the development of the gameplay outside of offhand mentions of wanting car combat and new gun mods, with a few developers mentioning the difficulty of populating the desert area since it was over 5 times the size of Haven City. Jak 3 released on November 9th, 2004 to similar, if slightly less enthusiastic acclaim to its predecessors, with it only selling about 1.3 million copies, half that of Jak 2. However, it was still considered a success and eventually became a member of Sony's Greatest Hits collection, wrapping up the trilogy for good. Afterwards, there were 2 spin-off games released, Jak X Combat Racing and Daxter, along with a PSP follow-up subtitled The Lost Frontier. I won't be covering the spin-off since I would like to stick to the mainline games for this series, and I won't be going over The Lost Frontier because that game was so aggressively mediocre that even one of Naughty Dog's producers has gone on to mention his disappointment with the game, stating that he wasn't happy with that being Jak's swan song. So, for all intents and purposes, Jak 3 is often considered the finale to the franchise, with no sight of a Jak 4 on the horizon. They did start designing a follow-up, but the idea was scrapped in favor of developing The Last of Us instead. So for now, let's take a look at the end of one of gaming history's most unique series, Jak 3. The game begins with an establishing shot of a desert when a hovercraft flies into view. When it lands, we see our heroes being forced out by Ashlyn and this old dude. Turns out his name is Count Veigar, and they're sending Jak into the wasteland outside of Haven City after the council voted that Jak was responsible for the Metalhead invasion. Ashlyn apologizes, saying there was nothing she could do, and gives Jak a blinking device before heading out. As the ship leaves, it's revealed that Daxter and Pecker stayed behind to support Jak. As the 3 wander the wasteland, they eventually pass out as Jak remembers what got him there. The first flashback shows Torn and Samos telling Jak that the war hasn't ended despite Kor's death, with the strongest metalheads surviving, and apparently the people are blaming Jak for all of this. The second flashback has Jak and Samos looking over the city, with Torn saying that his men are losing ground. Ashlyn says that Jak's friendship with Crew is the reason why he's deemed responsible for the invasion before the palace is destroyed. Back in the desert, we see a gruff-looking set of desert dwellers come upon our heroes. Apparently, they were following the beacon that Ashlyn gave to Jak, so they take him to safety and we get our title screen. And hey, it's got sound this time, so we're off to a pretty good start. It's just desert noises instead of actual music, but it is appreciated. That said, I'm not sure I buy that the city suspects Jack of aiding the metalheads simply because he worked for Crew. Crew was supposed to be the top dog of Haven City's seedy underbelly. He would have had a lot of associates, so why is Jack the only one under scrutiny? Personally, I think it would have made a lot more sense if Jack was being blamed because of the Baron's propaganda before he died. Also, if Ashlyn took her father's place upon his death, shouldn't she have supreme control like he did? What's this council we're hearing of for the first time? Anyway, when we start the story, we see that Jack and Daxter have healed as one of the Wastelanders introduces himself as Damus, King of Spargus, a city of people exiled from Haven City. He tells them that as thanks for saving their lives, Jack and Daxter need to prove their worth by working for him before they can become citizens. We also get a clever shot of a precursor orb in the background that can be retrieved later. From here, the two are transported to the Spargus Arena, where we learn that Pecker has taken his place as Damus's advisor. After a quick presentation to the crowd, the player is given control for a quick tutorial. Of course, the first thing I do is make the camera controls normal again before hopping in. The first challenge is a simple platforming course. Here, the game teaches all of Jack's movement abilities, and while you can still die by falling into the lava, the challenge is easy enough where most people won't have any issues. Plus, it makes more sense to have death pits in a battle arena than, say, in the middle of the Baron's palace. Second is a combat challenge. Damus gives Jack a gun, and Daxter gets terrified of the idea that they'll have to fight actual living people with guns. You know, despite fighting an entire city full of them in the last game. Here, different combatants pop out of containers surrounding the arena, and every once in a while the floor is flooded with lava, forcing players to retreat to the boxes lying around for safety. And this challenge is really hard for a tutorial. The challengers take away 2 sections of health with each hit, and touching the lava means instant death. I get the idea of making Spargus out to be a really dangerous place, but this is kinda ridiculous, particularly for newer players, and it's kinda weird that Damus gave Jack a gun so he could fight a swarm of melee combatants. Nepotism at its finest, and you'll see what I mean later on. Lastly, near the end of the challenge, Jack will transform into Dark Jack automatically, requiring the last few combatants to be taken out with melee. Story-wise, I understand why this happens, but the game doesn't even explain what this is or how to control him. Again, not a problem for someone who's played the game 4 times now, but definitely an issue for someone new. After killing a bunch of people, Jack returns and finds Damus is impressed with his dark abilities. He rewards Jack with the first of 3 arena badges, with 3 being the requisite number to attain Spargus citizenship. He also gets the blaster gun mod and a key to the city with a warning that while he's free to go, the desert is too dangerous for this to be a true gift of freedom. On their way back, the duo runs into another Wastelander who helps save them, Cleaver, who tasks them with ridding Spargus of some vermin in order to be allowed rental of his racing buggy if Damus ever lets them leave the city. I mean, Damus already did give them the key in and out, but whatever. Here, the player needs to ride around the entirety of Spargus on a leaper to catch 6 of the pests, which is a clever way to introduce them to the entirety of the city as well as leaper riding. Plus, the leaper is clearly meant to be a descendant of the Flut from the first game, which is a really neat callback. Once the little guys are all swallowed up, the city is open and free to explore, and I've gotta say, this opening is solid. A little harsh with the combat difficulty, and the reasoning for Jack being here is pretty flimsy at best, but the exploration of the city, introduction of a unique location with interesting characters, and the ability to use your gun right away are all great choices that improve the pacing of this game quite a bit. The player has no idea whether or not to trust Damus and Cleaver. They're unfamiliar with this new place and its rules. It's mostly foreign to them, but at the same time, they seem like they fit right in given Jack's brash, overconfident attitude and Daxter's outspoken cockiness. Plus, getting out of Haven City makes for a refreshing change of pace that makes the return all more welcome later on. With the city wide open, the duo goes on to find a mysterious satellite on the shores of Spargus with a monk examining it. He introduces himself as Seam, monk of the Precursors and self-important jackass. He doesn't trust Jack after seeing his transformation in the arena, but just as they're about to part, the satellite opens up, allowing Jack the ability to hack inside to get its dark eco crystal before it self-destructs. Seam then leaves them with an ominous warning that while Daxter may bear the colors of the precursors, heroes are no good to this world. So I guess that means the precursors were orange? Weird detail to bring up, but okay. They then head out to the wasteland for a race against Cleaver, who offers to bet one of his buggies in exchange for Daxter's life. Which Jack accepts? Like, I get that it's for comedy, but really? Jack bets Daxter's life over a car. So, obviously they win and go on to collect some artifacts uncovered in the desert, one of which was apparently Mar's old armor that just happened to be lying around for some reason. Back in the city, they beat Seam in a race to win a light eco crystal, and he warns about the mysterious star that's been hovering over the planet for a while, saying that it bears a bad omen. Moving on, while killing some metalhead beasts, they find a hologram of their leader, who recognizes Jack before turning off the communicator. They then go on to do some odd jobs for Damus and win another gun mod in the arena, leading to a pretty weird exchange.
You did very well, Jack. You make me proud that our training program is so good.
They're then told to corral some leapers, leading to this other odd exchange.
You have a reputation for being rash. Didn't your father ever tell you to pick your battles wisely?
I didn't know my father.
Okay, look, I get that foreshadowing is a thing, but like, is it possible for a story to contain its own spoilers? Because this is just ridiculous. And it's not the only hint we're going to get as to what's coming. It's just strange to see such blunt writing from Naughty Dog of all developers. Soon after, they're tasked with rescuing Wastelanders trapped out in the desert, so I guess Damus is more merciful than he seems. Upon finding the final Wastelander dead and retrieving his dark eco crystal, a giant tentacle monster pops out of the ground, and since this game wasn't made in Japan, it attacks. Our heroes defeat the machine and head back to the city. Later on, they participate in the third and final arena challenge before attaining Spargus citizenship. Unfortunately, when they're about to win a victory royale, Sig pops out and both sides agree to end the fight. This is considered blasphemy by Damus, who reprimands them for not murdering a close ally, so I guess Damus isn't as merciful as he seems. Here we learn that Sig was actually a spy, tasked with informing Damus of the goings-on in Haven City. Damus tells them that to repay their debt, they need to take out some troublesome metalheads out in the wasteland. They do so, and then discover a path to a mysterious temple out in the wasteland volcano. Once inside, they manage to reach a device that grants Jack the ability to turn invisible. And further in, they discover a massive precursor statue being examined by Seam and Vigor, working together to reach the catacombs in Haven City. When the coast is clear, they approach the statue, which comes to life and balances Jack out with some light eco, granting him the power to heal himself. Jack also mentions that he feels more calm, with the negativity from the dark eco fading away. He then gets a call from Ashlyn asking to meet near Spargus, and when he arrives, she refuses to tell him how she knows Damus, and the two are attacked by marauders. They fight them off, and Ashlyn asks Jack to come back and help the resistance now that Vigor's taken control, but he refuses, saying that the entirety of the city can rot for all he cares. That's right. Torn, Samos, Kira, all of them can rot in hell. Jack doesn't care about them at all. And, well, as you'll see moving forward, that's not entirely sarcasm. Ashlyn gives him the jetboard and his old amulet before flying off. Jack soon gets another eco power in the temple and makes his way through the precursor subrails to find Vigor in his way. He goes on a typical villain monologue about how he wants to reach the planet's core and obtain the precursor's legendary power, stating that he was in fact the one who blew up the palace, all in order to rid the world of dark eco and be the hero who saves the world from the nightmare coming from the sky. He then uses his apparently magic staff to command a precursor robot to come to life and attack. Jack takes it down and makes it to Haven City, where they then run into Samos, who tells them to go through the sewers to reach the city center and find Torn. Kira's there too, and completely silent. Literally doesn't even say hi. Jack, in a complete 180, travels through the sewers to make his way to Torn at the Naughty Otzel, and immediately begins helping the Resistance by destroying some Crimson Guard stuff around the city, eventually finding out through a hologram that Errol is actually the one in control of the metalheads. The two also head to the gun range to get a new mod from Tess, who's a lot more overtly flirty with Daxter this time. In Jak 2, I always got the sense that she was just leading him on, but here, she really wants to fuck that Otzel. They make their way through the Metalhead nest and destroy some more KG and Metalhead strongholds, even getting to work with Jinx in a tolerable mission this time, before reaching the old headquarters in the high-end district and meeting up with Onin, Pecker, Ashlyn, Samos, and I think her name's Kyra? Doesn't matter, not important. Suddenly, the hideout is attacked, and upon return to HQ, Viger shows up, offering to turn on the planetary defense grid in exchange for getting rid of Jak. But the team is by his side this time, and Ashlyn dissolves the council and strips Viger of all power and authority. Not sure why she didn't do that in the first place, but okay. Or why the group lets Viger leave instead of arresting him and forcing him to explain how to turn on the defense grid, but okay. Anyway, Jak and Daxter eventually make their way to Vin's old lab, where they find him semi-alive in the form of an AI. He warps Daxter into the computer, allowing him to get a cipher that will help get them into the war factory. While the crew is figuring out the cipher, Jak heads back to Spargus to take care of some odd jobs protecting the city, and in the process collects all of the precursor artifacts necessary to unlock the precursor tech in the forest. He even gets some downtime to bond with Damus, who mentions, yet again, that he lost his son. Jak returns to the forest and unlocks the precursor telescope, allowing him to see the dark spaceship in the sky heading towards the planet, but with no way to stop it at the moment, he decides to head to the war factory and take that down instead. After blasting their way through, our heroes find a cybernetically enhanced Errol waiting for them. He says that he wants to destroy all light eco and attain the power promised to him by the Dark Makers on the spaceship. After his defeat, he escapes into a portal, but Jak and Daxter follow him in to end up at the Resistance headquarters? Well, that just makes no sense, but at this point I'm used to plot holes, so let's move on. From here, the duo gets a call from Seam saying that Errol's attacking the temple. They rush over, take out the metalheads, and find Seam, who thanks them before relenting that Errol got away with most of the precursor artifacts, but he did save the most important one for them. He then thanks Daxter specifically for letting him see the face of his creators, and the two head out. Back in Spargus, the Metalhead army is invading, so Jak hops onto a turret and takes out the Cloverfield monsters coming in from the water. When they're defeated, Damus mentions that these dark times remind him of the Metalhead invasions that occurred when he was the leader of Haven City. Apparently, Baron Praxis betrayed him and had him banished to the Wasteland. As thanks for his help, Damus gives Jak full citizenship, a beacon to call for help at any time, and Mars armor that he had originally been saving for his son. A quick flight to Haven City later, and the boys head back to the forest to take out some metalheads and use their new precursor artifact to beam Jak's mind into a robot on the ship, which he then uses to wreck some shit inside, which is both absolutely nonsensical and pretty cool. From there, they head straight to the Metalhead Tower and blast their way to the top to confront Errol and once again, just let him escape through a portal. But at least this time they managed to bring the whole structure down with them. Finally, it's time to head to the catacombs and use the power of the precursors to stop this invasion once and for all. They head to the palace wreckage, make their way through the destroyed market district and stadium, and just when a giant metalhead is about to finish them off, Damus Ex Machina comes to their rescue, having followed Jak's beacon for help. With the help of his car, Jak and Damus breeze through the compound until a massive blast flips the car, crushing Damus underneath. With his dying breath, he tells Jak that he's proud to have met such a brave warrior and asks him to find his son, Mar, handing him a duplicate of Jak's old necklace amulet before passing away, revealing that Damus is Jak's father to the surprise of, well, someone I'm sure. Then out of nowhere, Viger appears to mock Jak, saying that he was the one who stole Jak from his father in order to use his eco powers before the Underground stole him away. Jak actually transforms into Dark Jak in anger, which is a really cool way to show it off. But much like literally every other time a villain's been less than a few feet away, he lets Viger drive off towards the catacombs. Daxter, in a surprising turn of events, wants to hunt Viger down, which is a pretty touching moment given that he's finally putting aside his cowardly nature for his friend, and the two give chase. Once in the catacombs, the precursors offer Jak the ability to become one of them, but Viger holds him at gunpoint and steals the power for himself. It's here that the precursor statue begins to speak strangely and even argue with itself until opening up to reveal a crew of 3 Otzels inside, Wizard of Oz style. And this is absolutely hilarious. Look, I know there are some people who take this game seriously for some reason, but this moment is fantastic. From the explanation that Daxter was actually blessed by the Dark Eco instead of cursed, to his reenactment of the Power Cell dance from the first game, to Vigor's later transformation into an Otzel himself, it is absolute gold. I mean, it still doesn't explain why Dark Eco kills everyone else who touches it, and it does invoke the question of why the precursors made Otzels in this world animal creatures while making another species intelligent, but all in all, I just love this scene. They then teleport the duo to the Dark Ship, where they blow their way through until confronting Errol. Jack doesn't really do much aside from tackle him off a cliff, but it's better than letting him get away again. But apparently this gives the precursors enough time to power up their laser to fire through the ship, giving Errol only enough time to send himself and one Dark Maker to the planet below. Jack and Daxter head to the wasteland, take the massive machine down, climb to the top of its structure, and destroy the machine and Errol with it. They emerge from the sandstorm to meet up with Sig and Ashlyn, who gives Jack a kiss? What? Like, I know Kira's role has been downplayed this time around, but Ashlyn? She and Jack always seem to have a platonic relationship to me. Plus, wasn't she with Torn at the end of the last game? Really weird direction to take for sure. After that, the precursors hold a ceremony in the Spargus Arena to thank Jack and Daxter for their efforts, as well as asking Jack to come with them through the universe to help defeat the remaining Dark Ones. Jack asks to be called Mar, and Ashlyn is apparently surprised that he's the Mar, which also makes no sense because they're from the House of Mar, and Damus was a descendant of Mar, so what's with this whole thing about Jack being the Mar? I mean, the precursors do imply that they have time travel involved in future adventures, so maybe they were just thinking that Jack would go back in time and become his own grandfather or something? I don't know, but I don't want to think about it. Speaking of which, the precursors grant Daxter's wish of getting a pair of pants, and they turn Tess into a precursor as well, making Rule 34 artists extremely happy the world over. And we got a cool role reversal when Jack interrupts Daxter's kiss. Cleaver forces Vigor to be his sidekick, Jack appears to leave but then appears behind Dax just like Daxter did at the start of the game. Roll credits. And this story is absolutely full of highs and lows for the series as a whole. In terms of the lows, you have gaping plot holes and unexplained connections that make no sense, such as Ashlyn and Sig not explaining their connections to Damus, the time-traveling implications of Jack being the Mar of Legend, or Jack and Kira practically being strangers this time around. Plus, there's the constant MacGuffin hunting in each mission, some of which have little to no context, but that's par for the course for this series so far, so I'll let that one slide. On the other hand, this game has some of the best dialogue, plot writing, comedy, and touching moments so far. The scenes of Damus's death and the final cutscene bringing things full circle really make the story feel cohesive, and the context for each MacGuffin is at least clearly explained this time around. And there's no denying the hilarity of the game's best moments. Plus, the game has a clear theme of balance in the face of two opposing sides. Vigor wants to destroy all Dark Eco, Errol wants to destroy the light, and both are corrupted in their own ways. The precursors created all Eco, and the supposed curse on Daxter turned out to be a blessing. Even Jack gets his dark side balanced out with some light. It's cool to see this common thread throughout the entire campaign. All things considered, I'd say that this is the best story in the trilogy and clearly shows how Naughty Dog grew to become known as the masters of cinematic storytelling in games. Of course, their future endeavors would be defined not just by their plots, but also by their fantastic characters, so let's see if those hold up just as well. In Jak 2, our lead character went through some major changes. Going from the silent but optimistic and cheery protagonist to a violent angsty teen was a massive shift, and while it wasn't bad, it did feel a bit extreme when compared to the game's world and other characters. In Jak 3, much like with the rest of the game, it seems the team tried to reconcile these two personas into a more balanced version of the character, and in my opinion, this Jak is the best in the series. He's still got a bit of an edge to him, but he never comes across as a whiny teenager. Instead, Jak uses his anger and melodrama to contrast his normally neutral demeanor. This takes place at appropriate times and makes the dramatic scenes much more believable as a result. He's also pretty cocky and overconfident in this game, which makes sense given he toppled a totalitarian regime and saved the world for a second time in Jak 2. He also forms stronger bonds with the other characters this time around, with some exceptions. Starting off in debt to the Wastelanders makes Jack have to start from square one, and as a result, he slowly builds bonds and trust with the members of the community, which stands in stark contrast to the previous game where characters tended to either hate or accept him on a whim. His relationship with Daxter is also improved as the two are back to being a team. With Jack 2 having Daxter spend most of his time afraid of Jack and the two barely interacting during cutscenes, it's refreshing to see these two joking around and acting like real characters that enjoy each other's presence. There is one gripe I'd like to mention though. As stated, Jack's attitude towards the world is pretty neutral. He kinda feels like a passive protagonist again, just going along with whatever plan others come up with for him without having much agency himself. Even when he turns down Ashland's offer to help Haven City, 3 missions later he's taken out the Crimson Guard like it's Jack 2 again. It isn't a huge issue, but does limit how much character development he can have. It would have been cool to see him betray orders from Torn to help the Wastelanders, or try out his own plan only for it to blow up in his face and teach him a lesson about being so cocky. All in all, he's still a bit of a blank slate in terms of his actions, but at least he's got some personality this time around. Luckily, we also get a much better version of Daxter this time around as well. In the second game, he felt kind of unnecessary, only around to say stupid shit and crack bad jokes. In this game, okay, he serves the same purpose, but he does so much more effectively. This can be chalked up to a few simple changes that smooth out the rough edges from before. For example, while Daxter does still crack jokes and come off as a cocky jerk a lot of the time, this game shows a lot of his fear of the ongoing adventures. It's not like a deep dive into his psyche or anything, but it makes his eventual insistence to go after Vigor in the end much more compelling, as it makes him seem like he's actually got more to him than that cocky jackass persona. There are also a lot of other moments where he mentions small details here and there about wanting pants, watching women at the beach, and so on. It shows that while Daxter's not a complex guy, he does have desires and motivations in life. He just wants to have a happy life and relax, not go on all these adventures. As such, he serves as both a great companion and a decent contrast to Jack throughout the story. They're obviously friends, but they argue, wisecrack, and have differing philosophies on life. It is subtle, which is a rarity in this game, but definitely helps make the dynamic duo feel more like fully fleshed out characters than ever before. It also doesn't hurt that Daxter's jokes tend to land a lot more this time around too.
It's your death. If you fail, I can always use a companion in here. Oh, the fun we'll have.
Let's hope. Oh God, let's hope. It doesn't come to that.
You want a crown? I'll crown you. Don't make me come down there from this perch.
I got a perch for you, Birdie, right here. Twirl it.
That's it. It's go time.
Much like in Jack 2, Samos, Onin, Torn, and Vin are pretty much here to dump exposition and cheer Jack on, having only a few lines of dialogue in the game, and Kira's just been dumped to the side despite being Jack's love interest for 2 whole games now. Seriously, Jack and Ashlyn makes no sense. Even with her getting more of a spotlight this time around, she and Jack have no chemistry. I mean, Tess and Daxter have a super creepy dynamic, but at least it's clear that they like each other. Even Sig has a similar problem. It's fun to have him around, but he does nothing to serve the plot and never really has a moment to just chill with Jack and Daxter, so their friendship seems almost non-existent. The only returning characters to get some development are Pecker and Errol. Pecker is pretty much the same, but at least we get to see his and Daxter's rivalry play out a bit more, and he does actually feel like a helpful asset to the team. And Errol may be a bit one-dimensional for the main antagonist, but he does have a valid reason to want to defeat Jack, and he serves his purpose well enough. However, while the returning characters are a bit disappointing, some of the newer characters are pretty cool. I mean, Seam and Cleaver are pretty cookie-cutter, but at least they're interesting to see in action and have funny personalities. And Seam casually calling Daxter Orange Lightning for the entire game always makes me chuckle. Damus, on the other hand, is a great character. He's complex in that he does send people to the arena to fight for their lives, but he does so to toughen the population up to survive in the wasteland. He's incredibly gruff, but lenient with those who wish to aid Spargus, and the bonding moments between him and Jack make his death in the end surprisingly touching, even with the twist visible from miles away. And he's complemented well by Count Vigor. While it is odd to have him show up out of nowhere at the beginning of the game, along with a council that we've never heard of before and never see over the course of the campaign, he ends up being a pretty solid villain. His manipulation of Haven City and self-righteousness are on full display, and he devours the scene every time he shows up. Because while Errol is only out for revenge, Vigor is actually partially right in his goals. He wants to destroy the Dark Ones just like Jack, but he also can't put aside his ego, believing that he has to be the hero. And his ending is very fitting, with all of his misguided efforts resulting in him getting his wish granted at the cost of becoming an Ottsel for the rest of his life. Fantastic. So while the character writing has its ups and downs this time around, I'd say it's pretty much on par with the second game. Nothing incredible or at the level of Naughty Dog's future titles, but functional for the story at hand, and every once in a while, pretty great. Looks-wise, Jak 3 is a lot more of the same, with a few upgrades. See, Jak 2 had some of the best graphics on the PS2, and while Jak 3 has a few more polygons here and there, it's not really the incredible leap that going from 1 to 2 was. Instead, the game manages to focus on detail, sound, and color to improve the overall experience, rather than pure graphical fidelity. Jak 2 may have had some stellar visuals, but the designs were a bit lacking. A lot of the districts felt the same, the color palette was bleak and bland, and while this all fits into a dystopian society, it doesn't really make the game any prettier to look at. Jak 3's approach was to offer a lot more variation in its environments and characters. Jak has some extra details such as his armor. Damus and Vigor's staves are made from precursor artifacts, and a lot of the animations have been smoothed out or improved, like how going up certain steps causes Jak to perform a stepping animation instead of walking up like it's a slope. Everything just feels more alive and animated this time around. And one thing that really helps with that is the environment variety. The bright, sunny, or deep cool blue desert, dark caves, the red of the volcano, lush greenery in the forest, and given that this game is about 2/3 the length of Jak 2 and involves a lot less monotonous driving, nothing ever really becomes stale or repetitive. The voice acting is great too. Obviously, Jak, Daxter, Samos, and Pecker are just as excellent as before given the return of their voice actors, but all of the newcomers do a stellar job as well, even if Cleaver is a bit overdone as an Australian. Not to mention Phil Lamar not only reprising his role as Sig, but absolutely killing it as Count Vigor as well. I mentioned before that Count Vigor eats up every single scene that he's in, and Phil Lamar's performance is a big part of that.
Yes, you were that child. I took you from Damus, hoping to harness your eco powers for my experiments. Then I lost you to the underground. You seem upset. Did I tell you too late? You were the son of the great warrior Damus. Oh, and he never knew. How delightful.
He not only puts in the energy to make the character feel believable and entertaining, but he also just really knows how to make the guy feel hateable just through his voice. Kira, meanwhile, had a bit of a tough ride. With Anna Garduño out, Tara Strong needed to take up the role, but she couldn't quite get her voice to play the part. Whether it was Anna leaving that caused Kira to be written out, or Kira being written out that caused her to leave, I do not know. But they really should have done much better here. When it comes to the music, I don't really have much to say. It's a lot more of that generic backing track that the second game had. It may not have any tracks that get stuck in your head like the Haven City theme from Jak 2, but it also doesn't have any tracks that repeat so often that they get annoying like the Haven City theme from Jak 2. The music does fit each area well most of the time, but none of the tracks are what I'd call memorable. Although they did remove the additional tracks that play when action picks up or Jak pulls out his gun, which is a baffling omission. I thought it added a lot to the second game, so to see it missing here, it just feels wrong. Really, Jak 3 just takes what Jak 2 did and changes things up. Some aspects are better, some are worse. All in all, Jak 3's presentation is just a rehash of the last game with some attempts at improvements, and oh, let me tell you, that's not the last time you're gonna be hearing me say that. When it comes to gameplay, Jak 3 takes everything from Jak 2 and somehow manages to shove even more possibilities inside. And just like Jak 2, some work and some don't, and some really don't. But first, let's quickly go over the changes to the base moveset from the first game. Everything's still here. Running, jumping, climbing, long jumps, jetboarding, dark jack, shooting with the 4 main guns, and driving in Haven City's hover cars. That means that the stellar platforming and great auto-aim are still intact, but so are the floaty dual-zoned hover cars and mediocre shooting controls. In fact, the only major changes to the old mechanics are the skateboarding and dark jack, so rather than repeating the last video, let's go over those changes. Here, while a lot of the tricks and controls are the same, the skateboard has a couple of new tricks up its sleeve. The duck jump has a fancy ring around the board showing when it's charged up to reach its maximum height. The grinding works much better than in the previous game, with Jack sticking to rails rather than randomly detaching, and there are even 2 new moves. Jack can now shoot out a defensive circle from the board to keep enemies at bay, and even perform an about face on a dime. While both of these are appreciated, there's one minor flaw. The game never tells you that these moves exist. No tutorial, no special dialogue box, nothing informs the player that they have these abilities, so I didn't even know I had them until about halfway through the game, and this was my 4th time playing through. Still, they are much appreciated, especially with the ability to turn around, helping out a bunch when bouncing around in tight corridors. Dark Jack has a lot of similarities here, but with a few caveats. Unlike in Jak 2, the power can be turned off at any time with an additional press of the trigger. This makes him much more likely to be used since you don't have to worry about collecting a billion little black balls before being able to transform again. He also gets a cool Kamehameha blast that can destroy barriers, as well as the power to turn invisible after touching certain precursor artifacts. And while these changes are really cool, they still don't amount to much outside of causing me to use the Dark Bomb more frequently. Dark Jack's still pretty miserable to fight with when enemies have guns, and the invisibility is only used in a single mission in the entire game. While the effort is appreciated, it ultimately wasn't enough to make this particular mechanic live up to its potential. Maybe if they had put more areas in the overworld that required the player to turn invisible to reach some precursor orbs, it would have been worth it, but invisibility is only useful in literally a single mission. There are also a couple of minor changes that help the gameplay out a lot. For one, when respawning after death, the ammo is set to a certain amount, so you'll never have to worry about running out of ammo just from dying. Also, the Flut Flut from Jak 1 returns in the form of Spargus Leapers, and while they're only used in 3 missions, they're really fun to control and make for a great callback. As far as the new ideas go, let's start with the gun mods. Each of Jak 4's main guns now has 2 additional upgrades. The shotgun gets a chargeable ring that's useful for clearing out enemies, and a grenade launcher. The blaster gets bullets that ricochet off walls, and the ability to shoot out an auto turret. The Vulcan Fury machine gun got an electric whip weapon and heat-seeking bullets, and the pacemaker got anti-gravity and a freaking nuke. A lot of these ideas are really cool and can be implemented in a variety of ways to solve complex problems presented by the enemies seen throughout the game. Is what I would say if any of that were true. The same strategy from the first game still makes combat a complete joke. Jump, spin, and shoot the ricochet blaster and you'll be able to waltz your way to the finish line. Why? Well, not only is it able to fire bullets in every direction while the auto-aim helps out, but the auto-aim even takes effect after a bullet bounces off the wall, meaning that nearly every bullet is bound to hit something and all enemies are going to end up on the floor. I honestly don't understand how this is still an issue. All the developers had to do to introduce some depth would be to either limit yellow ammo, slow down the blaster's rate of fire, or make enemies with different colored armors that had to be taken out by melee or a specific gun. Since the guns run on eco, that would even make sense lore-wise, but as it stands, most combat challenges are gonna end up looking like this. Still, what the combat lacks in depth, it makes up for in fun. Using the different weapons is a blast, and getting to try out different methods of destroying enemies, while not challenging, is enjoyable in the same sandboxy way taking out cops with your arsenal is in GTA. So I guess things are technically better this time around, but not by a huge margin. Next, we have the Light Jack powers. There are 4 in the game, including self-healing, slowing time, shielding, and light flight. The first is incredibly helpful in a pinch, since the whole game freezes while Jak uses up light eco to gain back as much health as possible. I do think this may make the game a bit too easy at times, but it is limited and light eco is pretty rare, so I'd say the game strikes a solid balance. Slowing time is cool when used for puzzles, but it's also so limited that I can't really say it's useful in combat, and the ability is only used once or twice in the entire game as a means to progress, so overall it's a bit disappointing. The same goes for Light Flight, but at least that's useful for reaching new areas to find precursor orbs, which is pretty neat, so it gets a pass. The shield is completely useless though. At first it seems like it could help out a lot in combat, but really, it's more of a stall tactic than anything. Plus, with how easy combat is otherwise, it's never necessary. I guess I just wish the light and dark abilities were more necessary in the game. Maybe remove the overpowered abilities and make Jack able to use the other powers at any time. That way, more enemies and bosses could be designed around them, like a robot that fires heat-seeking missiles only able to be blocked by the light shield, or a tough metalhead that can only be taken out with a Dark Jack melee attack. At the very least, it would have been nice to see places where the player is required to use abilities to progress, like slowing time or flying, but it feels like once you get these powers, they become immediately unnecessary. It's a shame because there's a lot of potential here once again, but what we're left with is a wasted opportunity with some cool applications here and there. Lastly, we have the worst addition to Jak 3, the buggies. See, the cars in Haven City controlled really well, it's just that the city's layout made the driving feel tedious and frustrating. The buggies, on the other hand, have the exact opposite problem because their controls have major issues. There are 8 buggies available for the player to use at any time by the end of the game with a variety of differences. Each one has its own weapon, handling, speed, and weight, with all of them being able to bounce at varying heights. It's pretty impressive that the team was able to make such a diverse set of vehicles for exploring the wasteland, with a couple of major issues. For one, these things control like garbage. They all have the ability to drift, but it's completely unnecessary, since these cars all slip-slide around like the wasteland's some sort of giant ice level. Like, I get that handling a buggy in the desert is supposed to be difficult, but it shouldn't be to the detriment of the gameplay. Then there's the physics. I swear these things will flip over if they hit a pebble in the sand, leaving you to slowly wait for the game to reset your car just to continue with the mission. Not to mention that the most commonly required car in the game is the bouncy one with a really high jump, which also happens to be the one with the worst handling and most susceptible one to flipping over. And to top things off, the purchased cars. You see, some buggies can be purchased in the menu with precursor orbs, making them available to be driven at any time. This is pretty cool and would make for some cool variety out in the wasteland, except you can almost never choose your car during a mission. Most missions require the player to hop into the car chosen for them, meaning that no matter how cool you think your unlocked car is, it's relegated to exploration and side missions for the rest of the game. It breaks my heart because anyone who plays this game can see how much effort was put into making the buggies and their unique abilities. And some of the missions can be a lot of fun, but in the end, these problems end up killing most enjoyment that could have been had with this unique new mechanic. So when we get down to it, Jak 3 took a lot of problems in Jak 2 and fixed them up, but in some ways the team went too far in the other direction and overcorrected. The buggies in particular can be a mess, but even then, they're pretty fun sometimes. I personally prefer this style of gameplay more overall, but when it comes to which is better, it's down to personal preference. When it comes to how they're utilized, however, that's a different story. Each area in Jak 3 has taken lessons from the previous game, and some major improvements have been made to make each new location much more fun to traverse. However, with the mission locations being much more varied this time around, I think it's best to discuss the non-hub areas concisely. So when you're not in Spargus, Haven City, or the Wasteland, the game sends the duo to a lot of differing areas, each with their own focus gameplay-wise, as well as their own praises and faults. For example, areas like the mines, sewers, volcano, and Spargus Arena all have improved designs, and while downsides like waiting for the lava to rise and fall in the arena while being unable to do anything in the meantime do rear their ugly heads every once in a while, these outer areas are some of the best designed yet. So why do I say these areas have improved? mainly because each location does a great job of providing a solid gameplay balance. Most outer areas facilitate combat, platforming, skateboarding, and even the odd gimmick here and there, while the second game mainly felt like linear corridors with enemies dotted around. And while the enemy placement and variety still leave much to be desired as mentioned before, Naughty Dog did as much as they could with the tools available to them to make a lot of these missions fun to play, at least when outside of the hubs. Speaking of which, let's start with the return of Haven City, this time in color! The city's design as a level has been drastically improved in a lot of ways that can be primarily summed up to accessibility. In the second game, there were pedestrians and Crimson Guard littering the streets and skies with really tight, sharp turns that didn't suit the slippery controls of the hover cars. Here, however, cars control pretty much the same, but most drivable areas in the city have been spaced out. There aren't as many people driving around, and the Crimson Guard are no longer a real issue. It makes driving between mission locations a breeze, and a lot less tedious at that. All of this also makes side missions a lot more fun to tackle as well, since there's a lot less RNG pedestrians getting in the way of their completion. Not to mention all of the precursor orbs lying around. A lot can still be obtained in side missions, but seeing them on grindable cables up in the air sparks an innate interest in figuring out how to reach them. And with the city being about 2/3 the size of the previous game thanks to the Topple Palace taking out 2 districts, everything feels more streamlined as a result, inviting and interesting. It's a bunch of cool, subtle changes that make the city a real joy to explore. It's not perfect, however. Most mission locations either take place at the Naughty Otzel or the Resistance HQ on the opposite side of the city, meaning that traveling to either one can be a bit tedious with nothing much going on in between. Plus, even with the enhanced arsenal, there's not that much the war going on through the city does to invoke that GTA-style sandbox fun of causing chaos. So the city's not perfect, but it has been improved quite a bit. And that's not all. Spargus is another fantastic hub location. It's a bit less diverse than Haven City, but what it lacks in variety it makes up for in design. The Leapers aren't as fast as cars, but they control extremely well, and with Spargus being much smaller than the city, they're more than enough to make your way around in a timely fashion. The rooftops and rocky shores, along with the plumbing pipes around each building, make searching for precursor orbs and completing side missions super fun, even when they can be really difficult. It's definitely a little flat terrain-wise, but all in all, Spargus is extremely well designed. Unfortunately, once again, the Wasteland has to come along and stomp all over this game's better elements. See, the general design of the Wasteland is well executed. It's big enough to make the buggies feel necessary, but small enough to limit tedium during traversal for the most part. There are specific areas that have their own uses for main missions, and when you come back for side content, they're usually used in some sort of capacity again. Plus, the designs say a lot about their history. The racetrack is near Spargus, which makes sense due to the danger of going too far from the city walls. There's an abandoned town further out, showing its age and history as it's buried by the sand. And the Precursor Temple is isolated from everything else, requiring island hopping to be reached. In concept, this is great, especially since each location is also utilized in the side missions, but in execution, along with all the awful buggy controls, there are a lot of issues. On a macro scale, while each location is unique to reach and explore for the first time, on repeat visits for additional missions or side content, they can become tedious to access, especially needing to use the bouncy buggy to reach the Volcano Temple. Going super slow in the water, the tiny bumps and rocks everywhere flipping your car without warning, the tricky jumps and pitfalls that are really difficult to spot in sandstorms, all combine to make return visits a nightmare. But that's not the worst of it. There's also the Marauders. Anytime a player isn't in a mission that specifically makes them disappear, up to 5 buggy drivers will appear out of nowhere to ruin your day. They spawn automatically from any direction at random, meaning that there are some occasions where they'll be incredibly difficult, if not literally impossible, to dodge or destroy. Seriously, there are a ton of cool and interesting unlockable secrets particularly useful in the endgame available in the menu, but they couldn't include one that rids the wasteland of these annoying attackers. Not only can they interfere with missions that are on a strict time limit, but they still attack the player when they're just trying to reach a precursor statue to start a side mission. these guys end up becoming a tedious annoyance overall. And if you think I'm over-exaggerating by saying that the RNG of the Marauders makes them almost impossible to dodge at times, look up some world record speedruns. These guys hit them all the time because they're just so impossibly difficult to dodge. So all in all, the level design in Jak 3 has improved in most aspects when it comes to levels similar to those in its predecessor, but the new edition of the Wasteland is made much worse by the shoddy design. It's a tricky thing to sum up in a solid conclusion, but I think the best way to demonstrate what I've said is to go over how each mission uses the levels provided. So much like the other elements, Jak 3 is incredibly similar to its predecessor in terms of mission design. A combination of shooting, platforming, driving, and skateboarding, along with a host of minigames. This isn't the radical departure that the second game was to the first, but rather a rearranging of sorts. See, if we take a look at the gameplay variety graphs for each game, we can see that Jak 2 had a lot more emphasis on those core gameplay elements, with the minigames sprinkled in for variety. In Jak 3, there's a lot more miscellaneous tasks players are charged with taking over the course of the game, which is both a blessing and a curse. While most of the other gameplay elements are untouched, categorizing the missions this time around was more difficult, as many of the combat or platforming missions have elements of driving, jetboarding, and extra features thrown in to make a lot of the missions feel like they have some balance among the game's mechanics, which is great. I love that some of the combat missions will throw in small bits of skateboarding or platforming with Daxter, or jumping right into some other wacky trick. Hell, one driving mission even ends with a mini-boss fight, which is a really cool surprise. It just makes every mission feel like a test of the player's entire skill set, more than a level meant to test one specific ability. Plus, they implemented these cool things called checkpoints this time around. That's right, rather than needing to replay long and tedious beginnings of a mission upon death, this game sends players back to replay only a portion of each mission, and while it does help to make things a bit less tedious, the missions are still difficult enough to keep things interesting. Combat missions involving the Ricochet Blaster not included. And that's where my praise ends. While Jak 3 does a lot to make missions focusing on the core gameplay elements feel more cohesive, these missions are often overshadowed by the miscellaneous random bullshit that the game will subject players to over the course of the game. Putting aside the fact that all but one of the driving missions take place in the buggy, with only one involving Haven City's hovercars, despite the improvements to the level design, the minigames are all over the place in terms of quality, and if we combine the Leaper and Turret missions in with them like I would have done for Jak 2, that makes 30% of all missions centered around non-core gameplay elements. And to be fair, some are really cool or fun, like the Leaper races, using Daxter to make it to a switch in the War Factory, and flying a ship to take down the War Factory defenses. These shake things up and keep the gameplay feeling fresh upon returning to more traditional quests. Unfortunately, most of these ideas wind up being either slow and tedious, like controlling the blast bot to reach the city barrier, controlling the mech in the dark ship, unlocking the satellite in a game reminiscent of Onin's challenge from Jak 2, or any of the 5 turret-based levels. A lot of these have potential but couldn't be fleshed out enough to make them feel like more than half-baked distractions from the actually fun missions. And then there are the missions that don't work at all. Whether it's the slow, repetitive Pac-Man clone being bugged to hell and one of the only missions without checkpoints, the out-of-control missile that blows up if the player even looks at a solid object, or the slow and painfully difficult to control glider mission, so many ideas were just thrown into the game whether they benefited the overall experience or not, all for the sake of having more content. A lot of them should be cool, but failed to execute on their ideas properly and clearly needed more development time. Riding through the subrails could have been a fun time, but the lack of checkpoints and instant death pits combined with a lot of the areas looking nearly identical make the entire ride frustrating as hell. And the top-down combat mission is a great idea, but when the game takes away your entire arsenal for no reason and limits ammo unnecessarily, it brings any possible fun of this interesting idea to a grinding halt. It's so strange talking about the mission structure in Jak 3. In a lot of ways, the game fixes a lot of problems present in the last game's core missions, but rather than stick to what works, they needed to stretch the game out with unnecessary distractions taking place in required missions. And much like last time, if these had been relegated to side missions, it wouldn't have been an issue. But as a result, the game feels more watered down than spiced up. Luckily, the bosses do hold up about as well as they did in Jak 2. Setting aside the Tentacle Monster mini-boss, there are 3 main boss fights in the game: Vigor's Precursor Robot, Errol in the War Factory, and the end fight against the Darkmaker Behemoth. The first fight against the Precursor Robot is pretty simple but enjoyable. There are 4 main phases: dodge the lasers, dodge the shockwaves when it hits the ground, kill off the spawned minions, and reach the top of these platforms while dodging bullets and shoot down a minecart to drop it on the robot's head. Repeat 3 times and the fight is over. As far as first bosses go, this one's not bad. The phases are a bit repetitive, and the camera seems to make climbing the pillars more difficult than the actual platforming challenge itself, but the lasers and shockwaves are a good reaction test, the minions provide an ammo restock if necessary, and the robot's missiles can be tricky to dodge. Not much to say here, just a decent boss fight. The first Errol battle, however, is a bit less engaging. This one has 3 phases. Take out the minions, blow up the rocket bots to send them up to hurt Errol, and dodge his attacks while watching out for the collapsing floor. Hurt him 4 times and he's done. Unfortunately, with the advent of the Ricochet Blaster and the boring means of causing damage, this fight's kind of a joke. I do like the idea of the War Factory producing the robots as the fight is going on, but they get taken out incredibly easily. And not only are the missiles pretty easy to dodge, but I even found this exploit that allows me to take cover and take no damage whatsoever. It's a boring fight with very little thought or effort required to win. The final fight is all over the place in terms of quality though. In the first phase, you start out in the wasteland and use the assigned buggy to blow up 3 weak points on the end of each of the Darkmaker's 6 legs as it wanders around, and it's really tedious. Trying to get in front of this thing with the buggy's unwieldy controls and it continuously moving its legs to unpredictable locations is incredibly frustrating. Plus, the machine constantly drops bombs that give boost upon destruction, but since you can't look up to see them coming, it's a complete crapshoot as to whether or not you get hit. Plus, I find it really odd that the Darkmaker just kinda takes a casual stroll around the wasteland instead of actually, attacking anyone. And once it does come down, the fight just keeps going. From here, the player needs to climb their way to the top of the beast, taking out some enemies along the way. Kinda pointless, but alright. Once at the top, another fight ensues. Here, Jak must take out the tentacles and minions swarming the platform, then dodge the main head's giant laser, before jumping over the laser when it goes for a sweep attack and hitting it in the back of the head. 3 shots and the game's complete. While I do have my problems with the first 2 phases of the fight, this third phase is pretty cool. The lack of walls makes the Ricochet Blaster less of an option, encouraging the player to use more of their arsenal. And the combination of all these threats would make the fight tough, except that when the head is firing its laser, 2 vents open up to refill both light and dark eco, meaning that you have a dark bomb for every minion phase and can heal yourself too. It's not a bad fight, it's just underwhelming. And that's how I feel about pretty much every fight in this series, but especially in this game. You have this massive arsenal, Dark Jak, Light Jak, skateboarding, platforming, and all these other mechanics introduced in minigames, but every boss fight just comes down to combat. Why not have a boss that requires Jak to block shots with a shield, then fly onto its head to use Dark Jak's melee for damage, or a boss that requires certain ammo types to be damaged, or even one with long robotic arms that need to be grinded on to reach the boss's weak point. The bosses in Jak 3 are serviceable, but none of them really feel particularly creative or unique, much like in the previous game. And while you do still get that feeling of satisfaction and a decent enough spectacle upon their defeat, each fight leaves me wishing the team had gone just a bit further to make them feel special. And with that, there's only one more aspect of Jak 3 to discuss: the world design. At the time, this game was far and away the most complex title that Naughty Dog had ever made, and in order to keep the pace flowing and the game feel intact, it was important to provide a cohesive world that would facilitate these needs. Jak 2 failed at this, but I'm happy to report that Jak 3 does a much better job. If you'll recall from the last video, my main complaints with Jak 2's world were the travel times, the illusion of mission choice, and the lack of interesting activities in the open world. The mission choice is still as pointless as before, so not much has changed there. The main improvements have to do with the other 2. Jak 2 is a game that takes about 18 to 22 hours to beat. Jak 3, on the other hand, only takes about 12 to 14, and while that could imply that the game has less content, in reality it's due to the checkpoint system making long mission introductions a one-time thing, and more importantly, the shortened travel times between missions. This time around, not only are Spargus and Haven City much smaller hubs than the original Haven City was, but the lack of tight corners and pedestrians makes travel a relative breeze. Plus, most missions end with Jack in a location close to the start of another mission just like before. All of this makes the game infinitely less tedious and annoying to play, and ends up making the whole experience an enjoyable one. There are a couple of issues though. The game's third act definitely falls back into the old ways of forcing the player to traverse long distances to reach the next mission. Going to HQ and the temple in particular are a real pain, and the last few missions will have you going from Spargus to Haven City and back all the time. The temple is established to have teleporters, but rather than just spawning one in Spargus to make traversal easier, players are forced to travel to and from the island no less than 4 times. Which may not seem like a lot, but since it's at the very edge of the Wasteland map, the time definitely adds up. And it's really unfortunate because it's a blatant example of padding and adds nothing to the game experience. Meanwhile, HQ does the same thing by putting the go-to place to start a lot of missions at the very end of the Haven City map when the Naughty Ottsel is right next to the ship to Spargus. Between that and needing to activate that ship just to travel out into the wasteland, the padding does get tedious in the latter portions of the game. I just wish Naughty Dog had the confidence to ship a 9-hour streamlined game instead of arbitrarily extending things at the very end. Still, it's an overwhelming improvement over the second game. When it comes to side activities, there's a good amount to talk about, but first I want to admit that I was wrong in the last video. Jak 2 does have more than 2 types of side missions. They're just so rare that I never ended up running into one through my playthrough, and I gotta say, I don't think many other people have either because I wasn't corrected on it in the comments or anything, I just happened to look it up in my research for this video. Now, while Jak 3 doesn't really evoke that destructive sandbox gameplay of GTA, it does have a bit more variety in its side missions and better design for egg hunting. In the side missions, you still have the typical egg hunts, jetboard races, and hovercar races, but there's a lot more variety here with buggy races, precursor spirit chases, leaper missions, and even more diversity in settings since Haven City's missions are accompanied by Spargus and the Wasteland. There are still the issues of not knowing which mission will come from which beacon, but given the lack of civilians in Haven City and the de-emphasized hovercar driving, the ring races in the city don't tend to feel as tedious as before. The buggy missions and being harassed by marauders when starting them are still a pain though. Overall, a step in the right direction with only a few issues along the way. When it comes to precursor orbs, there's a big change here that makes the hunt actually worth the effort. The secrets menu has been upgraded quite a bit. Here, rather than unlocking gun upgrades and new buggies by progressing through the story, they're unlocked with precursor orbs. This is a fantastic incentive for finding them scattered around the map and a solid reward for doing so. Plus, as mentioned before, a lot of the locations and new powers really lend themselves to making the precursor orb hunt a lot more fun. However, I still cannot recommend going for 100% completion since the menu still doesn't have a counter to tell you when you found every orb in a certain location. Honestly, I'm really impressed with Jak 3's world design as a whole. It shows just how much potential there was in Jak 2, since with a few small changes, the game went from being a tedious slog to being a genuinely fun experience most of the way through. And honestly, that rings true for most of this game's different elements. Jak 3 isn't a perfect game. It's got a lot of issues inherited from its predecessor and makes some mistakes of its own. The game still has some tedium, the gunplay is made boring due to the ricochet blaster, and it can be really hard to find enjoyment in the Wasteland gameplay. But thanks to a lot of smart changes by the team at Naughty Dog, the end product is a game that I definitely found enjoyable. No matter the result, however, I've really got to commend Naughty Dog for this trilogy. I love the first game, and while 2 and 3 aren't really for me, I can understand if others might have an easier time setting aside their faults and having fun. And for a developer to take the kind of risk they did in making such major changes to the second game, and following that up with a ton of refinements in the third, it gives me a new respect for one of my favorite development studios. And with that, I've covered every mainline game in the Jak and Daxter series. There are some others like Daxter, Jak X Combat Racing, and The Lost Frontier, but I wanted this retrospective to stay focused on the headliners. Now if you're a subscriber, you don't need me to tell you that my upload schedule has been a bit, let's say, sparse lately. I do plan to continue with my channel, but I'm also in the beginning stages of developing a game of my own right now, so it's going to be a while before another retrospective comes out. I think from now on I'd like to cover some lesser known titles that deserve more recognition in one-off videos, like The Saboteur, Dante's Inferno, or Zombie U, but we'll see what happens when we get there. For now, I hope you enjoyed the video. Be sure to subscribe if you want to see more when the next one does eventually come out, and as always, have a mighty nifty day today.